You may even have to go to Mar-a-Lago. If you do get there, order the meatloaf and the chocolate cake.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in U.S. news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement Impact at the United States Study Center. Thank you for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to our elders past, present, and future. Since President Trump took office for the second time on the 20th of January 2025, he has driven an unprecedented level of sweeping governmental change. One of the first and most dramatic changes was to USAID. The Trump administration has canceled almost all USAID contracts. They've gotten rid of 1,600 positions, and almost the entire workforce is on administrative leave. So what is USAID, and why was it a target for major cuts by Trump? Are these changes permissible within the powers of the executive branch, and what impacts could this have globally? To discuss these questions, I'm joined by non-resident senior fellow Lester Munson, and he's had multiple positions on Capitol Hill, but importantly for this discussion, he also served as Deputy Assistant Administrator of USAID. So thank you, Les, for joining me today.
Mari, happy to do it. Thanks.
Awesome. At the end of the episode, we'll get a stat from you for by the numbers, and there's a lot of numbers floating around on this topic, so I'll be interested to see what we land on. But let's start with the beginning. Can you set the stage for us a little bit? President Trump came into office clearly with an agenda to dismantle USAID. So what is USAID, and has it had bipartisan support in the past, or has it always been kind of a divisive topic?
Thanks, Mari. Great question. U.S. Agency for International Development was started by John Kennedy when he was president in 1961, I believe, by executive order, but the executive order was based on a law passed by Congress. So the creation of the agency was very much a collaboration between Congress and the president, and the idea behind the agency was to combine a whole bunch of different programs the U.S. government was doing around the world: economic development, loans, technical assistance for various governments in the fight against communism during the Cold War, into one agency where best practices could be adopted, efficiencies could be gained, and you would just generally have a more thoughtful, effective, and robust foreign assistance program, more bang for the buck, that kind of thing. The agency ran through a bunch of different iterations during Vietnam. There were a lot of people from USAID during the Vietnam War, a lot of people from USAID on the ground trying to implement changes on the ground for the Vietnamese people. A lot of aid workers were killed in the war, and there's, and I'm not sure if it's still there, but there was a wall of honor, a memorial wall of people who worked for USAID who were killed in the line of duty, and it had almost 100 names on it. And so when I worked at the agency during the George W. Bush administration, and when you walked into the building, you went right by that wall. And it was a great reminder of the very seriousness of purpose that the agency had. I will say it was not without controversy. Aid has always been politically unpopular, generally speaking. One of the jokes I had with people when I worked there is people would ask me, "What do you do?" And I said, "Oh, I give your taxpayer dollars to foreigners. You're welcome," as kind of a way of diffusing any tension there might be. Foreign aid has never been popular. Presidents and Congress have always had to work hard to find constituencies for it and make a case for it and show that it's relevant to the American people. It was a bipartisan project for a long time, notably during the Bush administration. A lot of people think of George W. Bush as this very conservative president. The spending at USAID skyrocketed under the Bush administration because of his signature initiative that was fighting the HIV/AIDS scourge. PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, was his premier foreign assistance program. And I'm saving my number for the very end. It's related to PEPFAR, but that initiative, hugely popular. Democrats and Republicans did great work out in the field. Had support from people on the left, people on the right, had support from faith-based groups, from scientific groups. There was a real coalition that was put together to support that, and USAID carried out a big chunk of the work for that program. So It's a long and storied history. Hopefully, it's not at an end here with this craziness during the Trump administration, but USAID has meant a lot to the people who work there, but more particularly to the people out in the developing world who really benefited from a lot of the good work it did.
And I didn't realize the irony of it being set up as an efficiency measure to kind of consolidate and coordinate things in one place, and to think that it's the Department of Government Efficiency that is leading to drastic changes, possibly the end. We'll see what happens.
That was the idea in 1961. Today, there are approximately 25 other agencies in the US government that do foreign assistance programs. So there is this that have grown up over the last, whatever it is, 64 years. So there is a huge need for reform, I would say, of the foreign aid program, which is something we should discuss. It doesn't, I'm not endorsing what DOGE is doing necessarily, but there is, the situation is ripe for kind of a new, fresh reform approach, not very dissimilar from the one from 1961.
So what sort of aid does USAID provide? You talked a little bit about what happened, during the Vietnam War, but what has been the U.S. reason for saying, if President Bush had the AIDS effort, what is the reason that presidents say we want to provide this foreign aid and we want to take those taxpayer dollars and then we want to spend it overseas? What justification have they given for that in the past?
Well, at the end of the day, the most important justification for a U.S. foreign assistance program is that it advances U.S. foreign policy goals in the world. So those, during the Cold War, those goals were largely, let's counter the actions of the Soviet Union and its allies in the Warsaw Pact. It's vassal states in the Warsaw Pact, and offer the benefits of freedom and the rule of law in the West to developing countries. This is a pretty effective idea. And you saw in Africa, in Latin America, in parts of Asia, the USAID programs really helped make the case that the Western way of life, which is based on individual liberties and freedom of individuals to choose their own future and choose their own political leadership, was actually the better one. So since the end of the Cold War, however, it's been a little bit more complicated. Aid programs were used as a component in fighting the war on terrorism, going after root causes, what a lot of people thought were root causes that led people to support terrorism. More recently, a galvanizing motive has been competition with China across the globe. China has its own foreign aid program called the Belt and Road Initiative that arguably has had some success in tying some developing countries to China. It's also had some spectacular failures that have really hurt China's foreign policy. But the U.S. has and also at right about now, during this time when we're competing with China, there have been other motivating reasons for U.S. assistance, some of which are not really directly related to U.S. foreign policy goals. So they might be more of a humanitarian nature, kind of a good global citizen nature, and things like that. And the danger is with foreign assistance that the farther away you get from something that directly supports your foreign policy, the more politically unsustainable it becomes. So, for example, during the Bush administration, President Bush had a very activist foreign policy in Afghanistan and Iraq. One of the ways he balanced that was to have this AIDS program that met the challenge of the global pandemic of HIV/AIDS in a way that frankly saved multiple African countries from this horrendous disease and this virus. So there was a purpose to the programs. Let's spend billions of dollars to kind of take the edge off of some of these other things we're doing, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan. More recently, as those wars have faded away, it's been harder to make the case for a robust U.S. foreign assistance program, much is true in other donor nations. And we've seen other major donor nations like the UK, Japan, and others cut back on their foreign assistance because there just isn't the foreign policy focused rationale for it anymore.
And it's interesting you mentioned China, because one of the trends that our experts are saying as they kind of travel around the region in our part of the world. So we've had a number of our experts in Pacific Island countries recently and traveling around Asia. And what they are hearing from the partners they're meeting with there is basically, as soon as these cuts started happening, they almost had, Chinese representatives come like door knocking, like, "Oh, did that funding get cut? We can help. We can support that. We can offer that." And so it's interesting the foreign policy dynamic that comes into play when you cut out assistance. So Elon Musk and other people who are close to the Trump administration have called USAID a quote criminal organization. Why is that? Where does that concept come from?
Well, it's totally bananas. USAID is part of the U.S. government. It carries out the will of Congress and the president. It uses taxpayer dollars to do that. That go through a very rigorous authorization, appropriation, and disbursement process. It's just a crazy thing to say. And I think I think it goes kind of back to the purpose of DOGE, or the Department of Government Efficiency, which is this Elon Musk creation. And I think what my political analysis is that this is largely a distraction. And I think President Trump is intentional, and Elon Musk and this is, by the way, quite clever. I must give him credit. Have set up DOGE and these attacks on aid. And remember, aid has never been popular, and it is particularly unpopular now for a variety of reasons we can talk about. But they have set up DOGE to do these cuts and to attack aid as a way to offer a palliative to fiscal conservatives in Congress, particularly Republicans, particularly the so-called Freedom Caucus in the House. President Trump's real political challenge is not from Democrats. It's from conservative Republicans who do not agree with his big spending ways. And so literally two days ago, Tuesday, the House of Representatives passed a budget that is basically a flatline from the year before. In other words, fiscal conservatives are not really happy with this budget because it doesn't really cut anything. It went through with every single Republican except for one in the House voting for it. This is an amazing political feat of the president, and he did it by distracting them with Elon Musk and DOGE and these foreign aid cuts.
And his chainsaw.
There was a chainsaw, and we're cutting things, and we're canceling things. And look at all these terrible foreign aid people, being in pain. That must mean we're doing something good. The reality is, in U.S. government world, those weren't real cuts. Yes, grants were stopped and contracts were stopped, but that money has still been appropriated by Congress for the purpose of foreign aid, and probably will eventually be spent on some kind of foreign aid program. So this was a bit of a magic act, and the diversion was DOGE, and the real impact was President Trump is getting his budget through Congress. I have to say, I'm totally opposed to what they've done to the aid program, but it's quite a clever political maneuver and is being very successful. The Senate will also pass the president's budget for the rest of the year, and there will be a continuing resolution for the rest of the fiscal year here in the United States. This is a significant political development and, in a lot of ways, a win for Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that would be his first major legislative win of this presidential term, because he's been very active with the executive orders, but with the very slim, majorities that Republicans have, there isn't the wiggle room you normally would have for a lot of these, the budget deals that have to get through Congress. And, we've been looking at, is there going to be a shutdown and what's going to happen? And wrangling all of the Republicans who have these different views is really hard. So the fact, you're right, it's been effective for them to get to this point is remarkable. And even the performative nature, with the chainsaw and everything DOGE is doing. I mean, the website that they have where they're listing all of the savings that they have, and they have to kind of keep updating it. I heard that there was I think it was a $1 billion IT contract that one of the departments had canceled, and they're claiming all this credit for. And that turned out, yes, that was a $1 billion IT contract that was canceled, but it was canceled by President Biden, but it's being claimed as a DOGE cut. So it's more about like, look at what we're doing. Look over here. Don't look over here.
There's a lot of razzmatazz or hukilau or totally crazy things in these lists of cuts. One of the things President Trump mentioned in his address to Congress, and others have mentioned this, is a circumcision program in Mozambique that they cut as an obvious waste of money. Well, perhaps some people are uncomfortable talking about this, but male circumcision is one of the most effective ways to prevent the transmission of HIV, and is incredibly cost effective. And so to kill off that program very likely put some people at risk, a lot of people at risk of getting HIV. So this was it sounded like something that made sense, but in reality, the cut made it, when you talked about it in the very shorthand way, the cut seems to make sense. In reality, it's a terrible idea. And the US should fulfill that contract and help these people be in a better position to fight off the scourge of HIV/AIDS. But that's about the level of intellectual depth we're dealing with. And I think it really does kind of make the argument that this is all kind of an act for a certain political purpose.
Yeah, and so the way they're going about it seems to be as important, or maybe even more important, than the substance of what's there. You're in DC. You worked in USAID. I'm assuming you still have, contacts, colleagues, friends there. Can you talk us through, from everything we're seeing is playing out across the news, and it's, a long way away. So from your perspective, can you talk us through how the process of cuts and the closures has played out? What are you seeing there?
Well, it's been completely bananas. The administration came in and almost on day one put suspended all activities in the foreign aid front, which was kind of an indicator that they were about to take a sledgehammer or chainsaw to the whole program. The next day, Secretary Rubio did take a positive step and say, if it's a life-saving program, you get a waiver from the suspension. One of the things they said they're going to do during this period of suspension was evaluate all programs, review them, cut the ones that were unnecessary, and then keep the ones that were good. All right, in theory, that's a perfectly fine exercise. In reality, they ended up cutting more than half of the programs, which is a bad idea. I could understand killing off some of these more socially liberal programs having to do with kind of cutting edge social programs that I'm really not sure are appropriate for U.S. relationship with other countries. It's not it's other countries' business how they handle those issues. We wouldn't want anyone telling us how to handle them. So there's some legitimacy here to a very small number of these cuts, but many of them, the vast majority of them, were completely unmerited. And these are good programs that achieve positive goals in the world, that are the things Congress wanted, that the then President Biden, thought were a good idea. They went through a rigorous review process. They're well monitored. These are not corrupt programs. There's nothing remotely criminal about any of them. And they were doing good things. And the administration just stopped them. I think that was a mistake. If the administration wants to propose reforms, which I think they should, and wants to have a fresher approach to aid, which I actually think could be a good thing, there's a better way to do it. There's a way to reach across the aisle, bring Democrats into it. It's impossible to have a successful foreign aid program that doesn't have bipartisan support. And now what we're risking, previously, I would argue it tilted a little too far to the Democrats. Now, with what has happened in the last couple of months, this is going to tilt way too far towards the Republicans. You're going to lose any Democratic support for a program. That's a huge mistake. It's bad for not just the foreign aid program. It's bad for the United States. It's bad for our foreign policy. It's going to make everything a lot less effective.
And, you've talked about the role that both Republicans and Democrats play in terms of foreign aid, but all of these cuts so far are coming purely from the executive branch. And are these sorts of cuts, or this level of control, is that permissible within the powers of the executive branch?
Well, in some ways, yes, and perhaps in some ways, no. The Congress does appropriate the money to the president for his discretion. The president obviously plays a huge role in what the foreign policy of the United States is. He's not the only decider. Congress also has a big role, but on the day-to-day matters, it's Congress wants, and the president wants, the president to be making those decisions. That's entirely appropriate. It's the design of the system. It's basically in the Constitution. That's what makes the most sense. So the president does have some discretion as to if the Congress tells him to do something with a certain amount of money on a certain program in a certain country. The president has some discretion at a basic level on whether that's a good idea and whether he wants to be doing that and how it'll affect the U.S., the American people and their government and their foreign policy. And also he's in charge of executing on actually spending the money. So he can say, listen, I wasn't sure this was going to be spent the right way, so we pulled it back. We're going to make sure we're doing it the right way before we proceed. That is all fine and within reason. But if at the end of the day, the president has decided or his staff have decided we're not going to carry out the law, that is a problem. And so at the end of the day, the Congress or the president is charged with faithfully executing the laws of the nation. And if he doesn't do that, and if a court decides he doesn't do that, then there's going to be huge legal problems. It seems to me there are some legal problems here. There have been a number of lawsuits against the people who've been implementing these changes that have been successful, at least so far, in various federal courts. Judges have handed down decisions in favor of plaintiffs that were suing to get their jobs back or get contracts restored or to prevent some sort of arbitrary decision. So I have a feeling there are going to be a lot of legal issues here for the administration coming. And I think that's something that increasingly the good people in the Trump administration are aware of and I think are trying to address in a reasonable way.
Mm. And you recently published a piece about what you call deal power, and saying that that is the new soft power. So what is deal power, and what would that look like in terms of a USAID replacement or reform?
Right. So one of first of all, thank you for asking. I think this is kind of my theory of the case for the Trump administration. The way the U.S. has been doing foreign assistance during the last few administrations, up until a couple months ago, was the U.S. would decide what it wanted to do in a certain country that it thought was best for that country and for the United States. Could be a health program, could be an education program, could be a little bit of infrastructure, could be some humanitarian relief, or a combination of all of these things. Under the Trump administration, I think what they're moving towards is a much more transactional approach to assistance. So what I think the administration is going to do is go to these countries and say, what is it that you would like from the U.S. foreign assistance program? Is it a bridge? Is it a highway? Is it some sort of other infrastructure project that's relevant to you? Is it a series of clinics? Is it help on the school front? Would you be interested in, balance of payments to your government? In other words, direct cash assistance to your central government.
Hmm.
And then the Trump administration will say, great, we will do that for you in exchange for you doing these things for the United States. And those things are likely to be cooperation on migration issues, cooperation on counter narcotics or other law enforcement activities, could be military cooperation. It could be any number of things that the Trump administration has decided is a priority. In other words, I think this deal power concept is the Trump administration looking to turn at least a large chunk of foreign assistance into kind of a slush fund. And I don't necessarily mean that negatively, but a pool of funds the president can use to carry out his foreign policy goals. There's going to be some support for that in Congress, mostly among Republicans.
Wow.
But if they do this the right way, which they already haven't, so this is unlikely. But if they did this in the right way, you could get some support from Democrats for that as well. That will probably, this deal power concept will probably be balanced a little bit by continuing support for global health programs like PEPFAR, like the malaria program the U.S. has that I think is very effective, which do show real results and lives saved in the developing world. And there's a ton of support for it. I have a feeling a lot of the global health programs will continue basically as is, but the lion's share of other funds are going to be turned into this kind of deal power kitty of funds the president can use to achieve his foreign policy goals.
And do you think that deal power concept could outlive the Trump administration? Could it be a different tack that, say, Republicans take in future? Or do you think it's more likely to be an anomaly or something that's just very tied to Trump in particular?
I think it's going to be a little bit of both, and it depends on the execution. If Secretary Rubio can articulate something that really makes sense here, and by the way, he's got to do this on the fly. He's got to do this in the next couple of weeks. I'm not sure they had a plan for this. It's going to be very interesting to see what comes out. Probably early April-ish on what this new system is going to look like. I think it's going to be a real challenge to do it effectively. But if they can do it effectively, you might get some buy-in from other folks outside the Republican Party, Democrats, and maybe some foreign policy professionals who would say, you know what, that's actually not a bad thing for the president to have those kind of tools to counter the Belt and Road Initiative with China, if that in fact is the goal of the Trump administration, which I think it is, but I'm not 1,000% sure it is, because this guy's a little bit unpredictable. But if they bollocks it up and they come up with a system that doesn't execute very well, I think the idea will still be out there. But the next president would probably likely move back towards a more traditional aid approach, which wouldn't really be this deal power concept, be much more the let's execute on these programs that we know work, even if we're not getting a lot back from the country for what we're doing for them.
The deals remind me a little bit of, or I guess the nebulous nature of them right now reminds me a little bit of one thing we saw in 2020 when the pandemic was happening, was there was a lot of aid happening in terms of providing respirators or different PPE equipment. And I remember a lot of European countries kind of got stung because they accepted help from China, and then China later turned around and was like, "Oh, that wasn't a gift. Here's your invoice. Please pay us for
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
that we provided." And maybe it could go that way. U.S. provides aid, and then later it's like, "And here's your invoice. Thank you very much. How are you going to pay us?" So, what risks or opportunities do you think U.S. allies and partners might face in light of all these changes happening with foreign aid at the moment?
Well, the risk, I think is kind of obvious. If you're a developing country and you've been reliant on U.S. foreign assistance to feed a big portion of your population or educate them or what have you, that is now very much at risk.
Hmm.
And you as a country, you as a government are going to have to go to the U.S. and make a plea for it to continue. And so you're probably going to have to make some concessions. The opportunity is, frankly, for countries like Australia, which have a terrific relationship with the U.S. And I think also pretty good with President Trump, largely, to come to Washington and meet with the president and his senior aides, including Secretary Rubio, and say, we have shared goals in the Indo-Pacific. Here's a couple of places where we think we can work together with you to achieve those things. Can you help us fund a program that does something in Papua New Guinea or in
Mm.
Fiji or in the Solomon Islands or something like that? And say, here's how this is going to benefit us. Here's how we're going to hold off, Chinese influence or whatever the issue may be. And it could even be something shocking that might be a climate change issue. If a country like Australia is willing to go to the Trump administration, listen, this is really important in this country. Here's why. And if
Mm.
we can address it, we're both going to benefit enormously because they're going to be on our side when push comes to shove on this issue we're worried about.
Mm.
So there's an opportunity here for creative advocates and creative allies of the United States to come to the U.S. government and suggest programs and projects to spend that money in a way that's good for the U.S., but also good for, let's say, Australia. It's going to require some creativity and a little bit of energy and leaning in. But as long as someone can make it look like it's a win for President Trump, there's a pretty good chance something like that could happen.
And the way you describe it sounds very much like, people from these different countries, like going to Washington, D.C., having meetings, having discussions, like a very personal, relational connection. Would you see that, like, countries should send their representatives over? They should have these in-person conversations wherever possible. Is that a critical part of that approach, would you say?
100%. The personal contact is critical. You may even have to go to Mar-a-Lago,
Mm.
which is down in southern Florida, because that seems to be, at least on the longer weekends, where everyone from Washington who's important goes.
Mm.
And you can do a lot of business in Mar-a-Lago if you can figure out a way to get yourself invited. But yes, this is a relationship government, and in a lot of ways, the Trump administration is open for business, and they want people to come in and make proposals. They want to vet them. They want to look at them. They want to see what the benefit is for the United States, and then they might buy into it. I'm not judging that system necessarily as good or bad one way or the other, but that's the reality. And so for any country that is impacted by decisions made by the U.S. government, you need to think about a proactive strategy of dealing with the new sheriff in town and
Oh.
think of ways to bring things to him and his team that make sense on both sides, but will, kind of advance the relationship in a mutually
Mm.
beneficial way.
Mm. And for people considering making a trip to Mar-a-Lago, I'd recommend avoiding the peak of summer, because if you haven't experienced a Florida summer, I mean, maybe if you're coming from a tropical country, you're used to that level of humidity, but my goodness, avoiding the peak of summer will be a very good thing.
If you do get there, order the meatloaf and the chocolate cake.
Have you been
The
there?
food, I have been there, and the food is actually very good.
Oh, meatloaf and meat. I don't think I've ever heard anyone give a recommendation for meatloaf before.
It's counterintuitive.
Okay. Florida meatloaf. Go get it at Mar-a-Lago. Okay. So let's get your by the numbers stat. You teased it a little bit earlier. What number do you have for us today?
20 million. 20
Okay.
million. That is the number of lives saved since the beginning of this program I referenced earlier, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which has been going on for about 20 2 years now, I think, started in the Bush administration, still going today. Incredibly effective foreign assistance program, actually saved 20 million lives, mostly in Africa, but in other places too. And I would say, in addition to those specific lives saved, really turned around several African countries that were dealing with a horrible death rate from HIV/AIDS, and was just a transformational thing for a lot of societies.
Wow. I mean, that's remarkable. Rarely do we get stats on this show that, can be so quantitative in terms of lives that have been saved and the sort of difference that it makes. But I think it's fascinating to think about the impact that some of these programs have. But that one in particular sounds very, very significant. Now, as we wrap up, I'd like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest to our listeners. Our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, is co-host of the Asia Chessboard podcast. And with it's also run through the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I'd also recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, including all our election watch events last year and the Sydney International Strategy Forum. Les was on the panel for that forum as well, so you can hear more from Les if you listen to those episodes. You can find these on our website at ussc.edu.au or wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, Les, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.